So what I thought I would do is I'd like to introduce actually a concept to our discussion, and the concept here is of performance. I think the kinds of spaces that we're going to be talking about, or this move from tool to environment, is really a kind of performative question. How do you begin to describe things that are in flux, in constant motion, in change, through devices that would allow us to design with these technologies? To begin with, I'm just going to use John Mackenzie's quite detailed look at performance as a concept across a variety of disciplines. Mackenzie writes that in rehearsing a general theory of performance, I've articulated a number of challenges. Performance studies' challenge of social efficacy, performance management's challenge of organizational efficiency, techno-performance's challenge of technological effectiveness. Essentially, what Mackenzie does is he takes a look at from the post-war about how performance actually has become a mode of not only analysis, but it has become a mode of giving measures to things. Looking at something like performance studies, which takes its roots from the disciplines of anthropology and theater studies, how performance begins to define a certain form of efficacy. Within, let's say, management theory, which takes in the post-war away from Taylorist scientific management, the notion of performance of an organization revolves around questions of efficiencies. And then techno-performances, and here technology becomes quite important. How do we begin to talk about technology through questions of performance, because that's how they're measured, is through the effectiveness of a technology, the robustness of a technology. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to use just these three technological, organizational, and social measures to kind of talk a little bit about situated technologies. So the technical performance, I'm going to start at the end in some ways. The technical performance, what are situated technologies? The technical performance of a situated technology will primarily be built on two developments: the continued miniaturization of computing devices and the increasing robustness of wireline and wireless networks. So what is the computer now, and where is the computer? The whole notion of the miniaturization of computing has effectively, as far as technological performance, done two things. One, it has made computing cheap, and secondly, it has also made the energy cost of running computing cheap. This has made it possible for us to imagine that computing is no longer a way to think about something sitting on our desktop that allows us to run some apps, but computing begins to be embedded not only in our microwave, but also our car. So the whole relationship between what we have understood to be computing, or something that computes, has now moved into already multiple devices that we interact with. Secondly, there's a notion of a different kind of network that's now emerging. The notions of a situated network. Here, there are particular technologies of wireless technologies, like the Wi-Fi, wireless Ethernet, Bluetooth, which rely on proximity as a mode of connectedness. In other words, now the mapping of a network, which fundamentally was seen as something outside of notions of proximity, distance, it becomes one and the same. So the kind of overlap of what we had understood as a network and spatiality begins to collapse. Things that will contribute to, of course, this is a GPS, which allows devices to locate themselves, radio frequency positioning systems, which will also do the same, as well as acoustic frequency positioning. Now, for architecture, this becomes particularly interesting. Here you get a situation of a locationally based network that needs to now communicate perhaps over a very long distance, let's say a piece of architecture, but also a city. And in that sense, locational ad hoc networks begin to be quite interesting, because they will use intermediary, what's called kind of multi-hopping, to communicate over long distances. So here what you have happen is that computing becomes localized, actually becomes spatially local, begins to then be processed locally, and then moved across an information channel through these kind of multi-hop networks. Oops. So what's the network topology that we're talking about? This is quite an old image taken from Paul Baran's distributed communication, in which he fundamentally talks about a distributed network. How do you make a robust network that can take a war, right? To take on, suppose a war takes place and part of the network's destroyed. But what he does talk about is this decentralized network, this kind of network topology that is somewhere between a locational, centralized network and this kind of distributed network. So what are we talking about here? This new network topology where spatiality as well as networks begin to collapse one on top of the other. For one thing, there's locational specificity, but more important in this relationship will be the agency of things. In other words, material things will begin to take on a level of agency. They will begin to talk to each other. In other words, they have to be constantly looking out for proximity. Let me move now to this question of the organizational performance. And here, I think within the context of architecture, we're all too familiar. General conversations around architecture and computing always fall down to the question of tools. New tools that allow you to do new, interesting things. And the making of tools continues to be an incredible fascination. And this is clearly so because it contributes towards the kind of organizational possibilities that tools provide. For one thing, and this is actually Nicholas Negroponte's quote from The Architecture Machine of 1969, these 3 points fundamentally have not changed. In the first point, he says, the current procedures will be automated. So this question of automation continues. How do we create expert systems? In other words, how do we bring lots of experts into kind of an automatic way on our desktop? On the second one, which is a little bit more specific to another type of tool making, is the existing methods can be altered to fit within the specifications and constitution of a machine, where only those issues are considered that are supposedly machine compatible. Now this is the reality of these tools. In other words, they have their own logic. It's not us who have to now, it's not machines that have to learn about us, it's us who have to learn about machines, right? How do they think? Because that's how we must think. And this is a question of affordance, and a fundamental thing that people continue to talk about, the affordance of this tool, the affordance of this tool. Well, the affordance of that tool is tied to its own language, its own methods, and ultimately does that mean we become a slave to the tool? Finally, what Negroponte brings up, and is a very interesting point that I will carry a little bit forward, is the design process will be considered evolutionary. In other words, the relationship between the machine and the person that's manning or using the machine will be an evolutionary kind of relationship. This is where Negroponte himself devotes his own energies in the architecture machine and the machine learning group, and fundamentally, I would say, to a large extent, what the Media Lab began to become. But where does he get these ideas? Let me just quickly talk about these expert tools. Expert tools are those points 1 and 2. They haven't changed very much. On the left is Jay Forster's 1969 urban dynamics modeling tools. Jay Forster did incredible studies of urban dynamics, industrial dynamics. Basically, these are risk management tools that create huge databases of relationships and kind of allow you to manage risk. This is the same thing that we're doing here. Gary Technologies BIM is fundamentally the same thing. You're able to model these things quite precisely and therefore can manage costs, which are important. Now, mind you, these are significantly important things for organizations, and that's why this is where organizational questions are fundamentally based. But there was another dialogue that was emerging out of tool making, which perhaps I think is more interesting for what we're talking about. And here I want to introduce a person who probably will be talked about in interesting kinds of ways through the next 2 days, is Gordon Pask. Gordon Pask is a cybernetician, an English cybernetician, whose model of a mutualist learning system plays very strongly in Negroponte's work. Just about every one of Negroponte's text has in its bibliography something by Gordon Pask. What Pask does is, he actually, being a second-order cybernetist, he actually changes the relationship between the machine and the person to move it on to this meta level, which is that it's not so much important what the machine is, it's much more important the dynamic, the interaction that a machine and a human could enact. And this is what his mutualist model is about. Fundamentally, what it says is that we're going to move away from the master-slave relationship into a student-teacher-student relationship. Again, this kind of cybernetic cycle. The bottom diagram is actually a kind of explanatory of the top diagram. So fundamentally, in any kind of interactive system, you basically communicate with a machine. That's language L0, which is where the student, the machine communicates to the student, and the student responds and communicates with the machine. Okay, that's straightforward interaction. But what Pask suggests is that the problem with straightforward interaction is that you're not going to be able to talk about evolution. In other words, neither does the human, neither does the machine have any understanding of who they're communicating with. They're fundamentally communicating semantic passing back and forth of information. So he suggests a second language, L1 and L2, a language which basically allows the human as well as the machine to talk about what they're talking about, right? So in other words, they observe what they're doing. And therefore, you have this other language in which fundamentally what's going on is that the machine is creating a model with its limited intelligence, or whatever one wants to call it, of the human that they're communicating with, and the human is doing the same, right? And so these kind of meta models allow for a kind of evolutionary relationship between the machine or the tool and the human. Now, Negroponte takes this up in a very particular way. And in fact, what he does is his whole project, the architecture machine, is to create one of these environments, these mutualist learning environments in which they're particularly designed around the question of the designer. In the prelude to an architect-machine dialogue, the solidarity of the alliance will rely on the ease of communication, the ability to ventilate one's concerns in a natural or vernacular, and the presence of modes of communication responsive to the discipline at hand. An architect would expect his associate to have at least a graphic ability, etc. What Negroponte's interest begins to become is, how do you create an idiosyncratic tool? In other words, a tool that is very, very precise to the human that uses it. Not a generic tool, but an idiosyncratic tool. And here I think we will begin to talk about these kind of idiosyncrasies where situatedness begins to contribute to this kind of dialogue. What of course happens is that as Negroponte moves into a larger framework of the Media Lab, his interest is fundamentally into interaction. How do you interact with this machine? And the question of the interface, of course, will become important. One needn't only communicate with machines through symbolic language. One can do it through whistling. One can do it through other forms of vernacular. One can do it through embodiment, perhaps. And a lot of the projects that, of course, have come out of the Media Lab have dealt with this tactile information exchange. Okay, so finally, I want to sort of end with this question of the social. As we've sort of talked about, as we've moved from the technological specificity of the types of technologies upon which situated technologies will be built, and through the kind of organizational movement of the types of tools that we have come across, the question of the social performance becomes quite interesting. And here I take, and this is a very important actually text called The Architectural Relevance of Cybernetics, published in AD in 1969 by Gordon Pask, in which he outlines a kind of cybernetic agenda for architecture. And this is what he writes. He says, specification of the purpose or goal of a system with respect to the human inhabitants should be emphasized that the goal may be, and nearly always will be, underspecified. This question of underspecification is what I'd like to sort of pursue a little bit about what do we mean by underspecification. That is, the architect will know no more the purpose of the system than he really knows the purpose of a conventional house. His aim is to provide a set of constraints that allow for certain presumably desirable modes of evolution. Now here it becomes quite interesting, because what he's proposing is an underspecified program. That's not how you work in computing. You have to be very clear about what the program is. What PASC does fundamentally by talking about underspecification, and I would like to emphasize, underspecification is not about being unspecified. I mean, that's fundamentally important. It's not about being vague. It's not about being somewhat elusive. It's really about being open. How do you create a system of openness that allows for not accident only, but evolutionary processes of a relationship? Just to kind of talk a little bit further about it through an actual example, I picked up the Fun Palace, which I think is would call a case study in underspecification. It has 3 protagonists. The concept comes from a theater director named Joanne Littlewood. The other protagonist, of course, is Cedric Price, who does the architecture for it. And the third protagonist, fundamentally, it really is a project between Cedric Price and Joanne Littlewood, and Gordon Pask is asked to come into it and runs the kind of cybernetic systems of it. So for the first part, for Joanne Littlewood, what was this thing? Littlewood imagined the Fun Palace as a Brechtian theater. Her own work had been dealing with with a very particular class of people organized around questions of participation. And she imagined, as she says, at that time it was called the Fun Arcade, will be full of games the psychologists, electronic engineers now devise for the service industry or war. Knowledge will be piped through jukeboxes. An acting area will afford the therapy of theater for everyone. Men and women from factory shops and offices bored with their daily routine will be able to reenact incidents from their own experience, wake up to the critical awareness of reality. But the essence of the place will be informality, nothing obligatory, anything goes. So fundamentally, she was interested in orchestrating. Clearly, there was an orchestration involved, a choreography of a performance, but an underspecified performance, a performance within which there was room for invention, for creativity to take place. Littlewood clearly believed in the kind of Brechtian notion of allowing people to participate, to become not simply kind of empathetic towards other people's performance, but to actually participate in creating their own performances. Then there's the underspecified architecture that Cedric Price puts out. Price had been asked throughout the process to present what this building was, and he kept saying there's no building. There's just no building there. What is it? A few quotes that are available. It says, it's a large shipyard in which enclosures such as theaters, cinemas, restaurants, workshops, rally areas can be assembled, moved, rearranged, and scrapped continuously. And this whole idea that something could be scrapped. In fact, the project was imagined for a 10-year cycle. In other words, he had no sense that it had any kind of permanency in it, that it had to serve a particular purpose. It was and once it would serve that purpose, felt was 10 years was a good enough number, that it should be removed. Finally, there's the question of the underspecified program, and here is Pask writing about it. And Pask, I've taken also again out of that architectural relevance of cybernetics. In the case of the goal of the system is underspecified, the plan will chiefly consist in a number of evolutionary principles. Of course, this paradigm applies to systems which adapt over rather short intervals, minutes or hours. In contrast, the adaptation in a project such as the Fun Palace system took place much longer time intervals. For instance, 8-hour cycles, weekly cycles form part of the proposal. But exactly the same principles are involved. What Pask and even contemporary criticism of this project really see Pask's contribution as a form of cybernetic social engineering. And fundamentally, I think it misses the point because for Pask, it was never about the technology. It was always about the interaction. It was always about how people would interact with these systems. You had to underspecify these systems, but to underspecify them didn't mean not to specify. It means to specify in a precisely different way in which the system is allowed to evolve its own kind of relationships. So what can we expect from underspecified performative environments? There are a few kind of points I'd like to kind of pull out. One is that they must be designed for indeterminacy. In other words, the specification of indeterminacy is not about, I think, and we've gone through a few different cycles of it, about flexibility, et cetera, but it is it is particular to the situation, and it is particular to the moment. I don't think there are any given models that one can simply follow, but it's much more an ethos, an understanding that there's indeterminacy built into the system. The possibility to collaborate and learn. This opens up the project to other forms of relationships between people, but also between objects, one against another. And the possibility to collaborate and learn, or it's a learning environment. In other words, an indeterminacy can only be propelled forward if there's learning or some kind of social efficacy involved in it. Finally, the material agency and the Internet of Things. I think we're going to talk a lot about this question of things having agency. Clearly, we see in the Fun Palace that things began to have agency. Clearly, the technology wasn't there. There's centralized computing, et cetera. But we've been talking a lot about this kind of distributed computing. What fundamentally could that mean for objects that talk to each other, objects that begin to create kind of context for conversations among themselves, but also people? And then finally, of course, the question is the possibilities for more negotiable socialities. The negotiation of socialities, in other words, how do you open up social conditions to participation but also inclusion? This begins to become quite important as we talk about technologies fundamentally still as have and have-nots. That's an important question that must be placed on board as we begin to proceed further and talking about it. So what would such an architecture look like? I think Price has a pretty good kind of description of it. The architecture should never look empty, but never feel full. So on that, I'd like to give over to Trevor Schultz to carry on the next phase.